Hey guys, tonight we are slipping quietly into a garden that probably smells better than any candle you've ever impulse bought online. Imagine it, a moonlit courtyard in Istanbul centuries ago, where the stone walls breathe out the day's warmth and lanterns sway gently from wooden poles. You hear the shuffle of soft shoes on gravel. Somewhere, a water fountain murmurs like a half-asleep storyteller. And all around you, tulips stand in disciplined rows, each bloom catching the torchlight so that their petals look like polished glass. You can almost convince yourself they're jewels growing out of the soil, red, white, purple, even streaked like little flames. It feels enchanted, almost suspiciously perfect, like a video game setting where you expect a secret boss fight. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this one either, because a single bulb here costs more than your rent. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you dropped your location and your local time in the comments. It always amazes me how this sleepy little corner of the internet gathers people across every time zone. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The garden path crunches lightly under your sandals. You pause, noticing how the tulips aren't just planted, they're curated. Each row is a lineup of living art, and you suddenly realize that this place isn't about flowers at all. It's about power. For the Ottoman elite, tulips weren't a weekend hobby. They were a declaration, a whisper of "look at us, we've tamed beauty itself." The sultans poured resources into these blossoms as if each petal were gold leaf. Historical fact here, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman Empire cultivated tulips with such intensity that the flower became a recognized symbol of wealth and refinement. Ottoman chroniclers even noted how officials carried tulip motifs on their robes, a sort of floral badge of status. As you walk further, you notice guards pacing the edges of the garden. Yes, guards, because these weren't just flowers, they were national assets. Imagine a modern security team posted around your neighbor's rose bush. Same vibe. The tulip was, in a very real way, a luxury commodity worth protecting. Some varieties were so rare that owning one was like parking a diamond-studded camel in your driveway. Quirky tidbit, some gardeners believed tulips could sense music. They swore that playing gentle instruments nearby coaxed blossoms into fuller shapes. It's the kind of fringe gardening advice you'd find in a medieval BuzzFeed listicle. 7 ways to make your tulips outshine the neighbors. Number 4 will shock you. You slow down, running your fingertips lightly along a clay water jug placed at the base of the tulip rose. The air smells earthy, damp from recent watering. You can almost hear the secret calculations of the palace gardeners, figuring out exactly how much water, how much shade, how much sun each bulb deserves. And you sense their paranoia because tulips weren't just horticulture, they were politics. Historians still argue whether the obsession with tulips truly weakened the empire's focus on other pressing issues, or whether it was just a convenient scapegoat for bigger structural problems. Either way, people were whispering about flowers while armies marched at the edges of Ottoman borders. You glance back at the palace windows. Candlelight flickers behind lattice screens. You imagine courtiers leaning on cushions, sipping sherbet, and casually discussing tulip prices like modern investors gossiping about cryptocurrency. If one petal developed a streak or a flame-like marking, its value skyrocketed. A single bulb could be worth enough to fund a caravan's journey across deserts. And here you are, barefoot in the gravel, watching shadows of the tulips sway like conspirators plotting. The moon hangs above, fat and silver, as if it's supervising the whole charade. You know, there's more to the story that behind these quiet gardens are centuries of travel, trade, poetry, and eventual chaos. But for now, you breathe in, listening to the soft hiss of a nearby torch, and let the tulips stand silently before you, taller than they look, glowing like an empire's fragile vanity. You tilt your head back, staring at those tulips in the palace garden, and a thought drifts in like the night breeze. How on earth did these flowers even get here? They don't look native to Istanbul. They don't even feel like they belong in this marble and torchlight setting. Their story begins far away, out on the windswept plains of Central Asia. Picture nomadic horsemen. wrapped in furs, galloping across landscapes where the horizon looks endless. Out there, tulips grew wild, tough little plants surviving harsh winters and blazing summers. Nobody was sprinkling fancy water from silver jugs. These tulips thrived on grit and stubbornness. One historical fact to ground us. The word tulip itself is believed to come from the Turkish word tulbend, meaning turban because Europeans thought the shape of the bloom resembled folded fabric around the head. Linguistic fashion advice, courtesy of the 1500s. So how did wild steppe flowers become Ottoman prestige objects? Trade, of course. Imagine caravans plodding westward, loaded with silks, spices, and the occasional bag of tulip bulbs stuffed and beside dried apricots. By the time those caravans reached Anatolia, tulips had become more than roadside weeds. They were curiosities, then luxuries, then eventually cultural icons. You can almost see the flower's slow-motion migration, like a time-lapse, swaying in a Mongolian breeze, rooted in Persian gardens, bowing politely before Ottoman sultans. Here's your quirky tidbit. Early travelers sometimes mistook tulips for edible plants. One poor soul reportedly boiled tulip bulbs thinking they were onions. Spoiler, they taste terrible, and in famine years later, Dutch citizens learned that lesson the hard way. But in the Ottoman lands, the bulbs weren't food, they were gold disguised as petals. You continue along the gravel path, and the gardens suddenly feel like a museum exhibit without walls. Each tulip here carries an invisible passport stamped by cultures it passed through. The Persians admired them in poetry, writing verses where tulip red symbolized the blood of lovers. The Ottomans took that symbolism and turned it up to 11, making tulips stand not only for passion but for divine perfection. Historians still argue whether the Ottomans deliberately engineered tulips into a cultural brand, or whether it all spiraled naturally out of garden fashion. Was it propaganda, or just collective obsession? Either way, by the time these flowers rooted themselves in Istanbul soil, they had traveled farther than most people of their age. You crouch down and imagine a single bulb in its journey, pulled from dusty Central Asian ground by a nomad, pocketed in a leather pouch, traded to a Persian merchant, slipped into Ottoman hands, and finally planted here in soft, carefully combed soil. That bulb has seen more of the world than you, me, and the average pigeon combined. As you rise again, your sandals brush past a small mosaic set into the walkway blue tiles depicting stylized tulips with pointed petals almost like flames. It's another reminder, tulips didn't just decorate gardens, they invaded art, textiles, ceramics. You start to notice them everywhere, carved into fountains, embroidered onto cushions. They became part of the empire's identity, woven right into daily life. The air grows cooler. You imagine caravans still trudging in the distance beyond the city walls, bearing not only spices and silks, but the seeds of an empire's favorite flower. Behind you, the palace looms like a stone sentinel, but here in the garden, all you see are tulips silent, elegant, carrying centuries of migration in each bloom. You pause by a low hedge and notice figures moving in the shadows, men in plain robes, hands calloused, eyes sharp as daggers. They're not soldiers, yet they carry themselves with the same seriousness. These are the bostanks, the imperial gardeners of the Ottoman court. You'd think their job is just trimming hedges or shooing away bugs, but no, these gardeners are practically a secret guild. Their loyalty to the Sultan is so absolute that people whisper they're half gardeners, half bodyguards. Imagine a landscaper who can also arrest you. Comforting, isn't it? Historical fact. The bostanks were indeed an elite corps of palace gardeners who doubled as guards. They worked in the sprawling palace grounds, tending tulips, orchards, and fountains, but also patrolling waterways and escorting royal barges. Their boss? None other than the chief gardener, who reported directly to the Sultan. If tulips were treasure, these men were the vault keepers. You watch one of them bend down, brushing soil between his fingers like he's reading a coded message. His colleagues move silently, checking irrigation channels, inspecting blossoms with the kind of intensity you'd expect from jewelers. And honestly, that's not far off. Each bulb is treated like a ruby or sapphire. Rumor had it some rare tulips were locked away. shown only to the Sultan and his closest advisors' flower secrets, guarded tighter than battle strategies. Here's your quirky tidbit. These gardeners didn't just protect flowers, they had, let's call it a grim secondary duty. If the Sultan ordered an execution, it was often the Bostangs who carried it out, using garden tools as their weapons. Yes, the men who watered tulips by day could strangle political prisoners by night. That's one way to keep your resume interesting. As you walk deeper into the garden, you realize the gardeners are everywhere at gates, near fountains, along paths. They're like living scarecrows, except instead of keeping birds away, they're warding off thieves, spies, and anyone foolish enough to think they could snip a bulb and run. The atmosphere feels heavy. You picture secret ceremonies where gardeners presented the Sultan with new tulip varieties. Perhaps they unwrapped bulbs like sacred relics, announcing their streaked petals or unusual colors with reverence. The court would lean in, murmuring like investors at a stock exchange. And there, in the center, the Sultan himself, nodding solemnly over a flower, because in this empire, a tulip could be as important as a treaty. Historians still argue whether the gardeners were truly feared as executioners or whether later accounts exaggerated their role to make the tulip era sound more dramatic. Some sources describe them as simple horticulturalists. Others paint them as terrifying enforcers in the guise of gentle flower men. The truth, as always, probably blooms somewhere in between. You slip past a group of them now, their lanterns bobbing softly. The smell of damp soil follows you. You imagine their inner world, tending petals with one hand while keeping the empire's secrets with the other. The tulip beds no longer look like mere flowers. They're locked chests, each bloom a coded message, each bulb a reason to guard, to protect, maybe even to kill. And you're just a quiet guest tonight, lucky the gardeners don't mistake your curiosity for theft. You keep your hands tucked politely behind your back as you drift farther into their silent kingdom. The night air cools against your skin, and you stop at the edge of a broad rectangular bed where the earth looks unusually dark and rich. A gardener crouches low, dipping a copper ladle into a clay jar, pouring water carefully at the base of a tulip stem. Not too much, not too little, he watches the soil drink like a doctor checking a pulse. You realize in this empire, tulip care was no casual pastime. It was a science, a philosophy, almost a ritual. Historical fact, Ottoman gardeners were masters of irrigation. They dug narrow channels to guide water exactly where it was needed, sometimes laying clay pipes beneath the soil. This precision wasn't just about keeping tulips alive, it was about coaxing the most dramatic colors and patterns from the petals. The right balance of sun and shade, wet and dry, could turn an ordinary bloom into something worthy of palace gossip. You crouch down yourself, running your fingers through the fine soil. It feels silky, deliberately sifted. These gardeners weren't dumping random dirt into a bed. They blended soils like perfumers, sometimes hauling earth from distant regions thought to have special properties. The result? Tulips that seemed to glow with an inner fire when the blossoms finally opened. Quirky tidbit, some Ottoman manuals suggested feeding bulbs with a bizarre mix of pigeon droppings and crushed oyster shells. Supposedly it made petals shinier. Whether it really worked or not is questionable, but imagine being the apprentice sent to gather ingredients. Yes, master, right away, let me just chase a pigeon with a bucket. The deeper you wander, the more you notice details, rows of reeds laid over beds to shield young shoots from harsh sun, trellises set up not for climbing plants but for casting patterned shade. Water trickles gently through narrow, stone-lined channels, a soft lullaby of splashes. This garden is a laboratory dressed as paradise. You pause at a corner where several gardeners debate in low voices. You catch snippets, timing, rainfall, bulb depth. It sounds less like gardening and more like military planning. And in a way, it is because tulip perfection was a battlefield of its own. Historians still argue whether these advanced methods were borrowed from Persian horticulture or innovated within Ottoman gardens. Either way, the results were undeniable. A torch flares and you see rows of tulips tilted toward the light, their buds swollen, waiting for the right moment to unfurl. Timing mattered almost superstitiously. Plant too deep and the bulb suffocates. Plant too shallow and the sun scorches it. Bloom too early and the petals shrivel before festivals. Too late and you miss the moment of admiration. The gardeners live by these fragile calculations, balancing nature like tightrope walkers. And here's the funny thing. For all their seriousness, tulips are stubbornly unpredictable. A bulb can produce a solid red one year, then surprise you with streaks the next. Some gardeners whispered about hidden spirits inside the bulbs, tricksters painting the petals differently each season. Standing there, watching the flicker of torchlight dance across the flower buds, you can almost believe it. You lean against a low wall, hearing water gurgle in a fountain, and realize the empire invested more thought into these beds of tulips than most of us put into our entire careers. Soil, shade, water, timing every detail mattered. And the gardeners, with their hands in the dirt and their ears bent to the ground, were the quiet geniuses of the Ottoman court. You pause at a bend in the garden path where the torches thin out, leaving only the pale glow of the moon. A row of tulips catches your eye not because they're brighter, but because they're different. Their colors don't just shout, "Pretty flower," they whisper something coded. You lean closer, noticing how each shade seems to carry a message, as if the petals are tiny flags waving private meanings. Historical fact: in the Ottoman world, tulip colors carried symbolic weight. Red tulips suggested passion or divine love, white meant purity, and rare variegated blooms, those with flame-like streaks, were so prized they could signal rank or favor at court. Flowers weren't just decorations. They were part of a visual language understood by those in power. A breeze rustles and the tulips bend slightly toward you, almost conspiratorial. You can imagine a courtier presenting a bouquet of white blooms to a rival, soft, polite, but loaded with undertones. Or a suitor sliding a streaked tulip toward a beloved, hoping she read it as more than just horticulture. If emojis existed back then, tulips were definitely the Ottoman version, except much more expensive and with higher risk of sparking a scandal. Quirky tidbit: certain tulips were given extravagant names that hinted at their messages. Some were called things like Light of the World or Matchless Pearl, which, if nothing else, made writing love poetry a lot easier. Nothing says romance like handing someone a flower literally named The Perfect Lover and hoping they get the hint. You picture banquets in the palace where tulips were carefully arranged not just for beauty but for meaning. A room filled with red blossoms might signal celebration or passion, while a discreet cluster of purples hinted at luxury and aristocracy. Historians still argue whether everyone at court truly understood these coded meanings, or if it was a secret language confined to the elite. It's possible that most servants just saw a lot of red flowers, while the viziers debated which particular shade meant loyalty, versus "please don't poison me at dinner." The more you think about it, the stranger it feels. A single bulb could stir jealousy, admiration, even fear. It wasn't the flower itself, but the message it carried. And you, walking now between rows of pale white tulips, glowing like little lanterns in the dark, feel as if you're strolling through an alphabet written in petals. You glance at your reflection in a nearby fountain. The water shivers, distorting your face, and for a moment you look like one of those courtiers yourself wrapped in silks, holding a tulip like it's a letter sealed in wax. What message would you send? A bold streaked bloom declaring ambition? A simple red one confessing love? Or maybe, if you were smart, you'd pick a plain yellow just friendship, no strings attached, because politics is complicated enough without dragging flowers into it. A nightingale calls somewhere in the trees and you step onward, surrounded by tulips that aren't just blossoms but sentences, fragments of a secret dialogue stretching across centuries. You leave behind the coated tulip beds and find yourself facing a marble terrace that overlooks the garden like a stage. Cushions are spread across the floor, low tables gleam with polished brass, and in the center sits the invisible weight of history, the sultans themselves, men who ruled an empire yet found themselves utterly bewitched by flowers. Historical fact: Sultan Ahmed III, who reigned during what became known as the Tulip era, 1718 to 1730, was famous for his obsession. Under his watch, tulip festivals became dazzling spectacles, with entire neighborhoods decorated in blooms and nights lit by floating lanterns. The flower wasn't just decoration, it was a badge of refinement, prosperity, and imperial power. You imagine the Sultan reclining on cushions, sipping sweet sherbet through a jewel-studded straw, while tulips nodded politely in pots nearby. Around him, viziers flatter his taste in bulbs, as if they were discussing matters of state. And maybe they were, because tulips could be currency in their own right. Owning rare varieties proved you had both wealth and the connections to acquire them. Quirky tidbit. Some sultans were so taken with tulips that they personally dabbled in crossbreeding. Picture the ruler of millions crouched with a tiny brush, tickling pollen from one blossom to another. If you ever thought your boss had odd hobbies, just remember Ahmed III micromanaging petals while also keeping an eye on Europe's wars. But there was something deeper at work. To the sultans, tulips weren't just status symbols, they were reflections of divine perfection. Their symmetry, their ephemeral beauty, their brief blooming seasonal seemed like metaphors for the fleeting nature of life and power. Historians still argue whether the sultans truly embraced this spiritual reading, or if it was mostly a convenient excuse to justify extravagant spending on flower beds. You can almost hear the conversations. A sultan gestures to a striped tulip, its petals curled like tongues of fire. "This one," he says, "is as rare as loyalty." A vizier nods furiously, scribbling notes as if a flower's curve might decide tomorrow's policy. Somewhere in the shadows, a gardener shuffles nervously, praying the blossom doesn't wilt under the pressure. The terrace fills with the soft sound of fountains. Courtiers fan themselves, servants glide in with silver trays. And through it all, tulips stand proudly, treated not like plants, but like living thrones, fragile yet powerful, silent yet commanding. You realize now that the obsession wasn't really about flowers at all. It was about control, prestige, and the delicate performance of empire. You wander past the terrace, leaving the sultans behind, but their laughter lingers in the air. Even centuries later, you can feel their presence in every tulip that blooms in Istanbul, each petal carrying a faint echo of royal obsession. The terrace fades behind you, and the path bends toward a quieter courtyard. Here, the air is heavy with ink and paint rather than politics. You hear the faint scratch of a reed pen on paper, the soft brushing of pigments over silk. This is where tulips bloom not in soil but in art. Historical fact, during the Ottoman tulip era, poets, calligraphers, and miniature painters filled their works with tulip imagery. The flower became a recurring motif, standing for elegance, refinement, and sometimes divine order. Ottoman poetry often used the tulip as a metaphor for the beloved's lips or the fleeting perfection of youth. You lean over a table where a painter sits cross-legged, holding a fine brush between steady fingers. He's painting tulips onto the page of a miniature manuscript, each petal outlined with care. Each shade blended until the flower looks almost more perfect than the real thing. He doesn't glance up, doesn't need to. His hand moves with practiced devotion, as if he's copying something eternal. Nearby, a poet murmurs verses under his breath. His lines compare the curve of a tulip to a lover's smile, the deep red to a drop of wine. The words float up into the air like smoke, curling around you. You wonder if the Sultan ever heard these verses recited at court, nodding gravely as though the empire itself depended on metaphor. Quirky tidbit. Some poets were so enamored with tulips that they wrote entire collections devoted to them. And in one delightful case, an artist painted tulips so obsessively that people joked he must have been in love with the flower. Honestly, it's not that different from someone today who has a whole Instagram account for their houseplants. Historians still argue whether the artistic tulip craze represented genuine cultural passion or whether it was just the fashionable thing to do, like marble statues in Renaissance Florence or selfies with latte art now. Was every poet truly enchanted, or were some just chasing sponsorships from tulip-loving patrons? You run your fingers along the edges of a manuscript. The vellum is smooth, and the ink shimmers faintly in the lantern light. Tulips curl across the margins like little flames, transforming the book into a garden of its own. You realize that even if the flowers outside wilt and vanish, here they remain immortal. Stepping back, you see the courtyard as a whole, painters bent over brushes, poets muttering verses, calligraphers shaping the word lolly tulip in graceful script. The atmosphere is hushed but not solemn. It's the quiet hum of creativity, a reminder that tulips weren't just living decorations, they were muses. They bled into ink and paint, ensuring that long after their petals fell, their beauty would echo through Ottoman art. You close your eyes, listening to the soft rhythm of pen strokes and whispered rhyme. It feels like another kind of garden, one that blooms on paper, eternal and untouchable. You drift from the hushed courtyard of poets and painters back into the open air, and suddenly the garden doesn't feel private anymore. The quiet order of torches and whispers is replaced by something festive, lanterns bobbing on strings, laughter spilling through the night, and the distant strum of music carried on the breeze. You've stumbled into the heart of a tulip festival where the empire turns its gardens into a dreamscape. Historical fact, during the tulip era under Sultan Ahmed III, especially in the 1720s, tulip festivals became legendary night events. Gardens and streets of Istanbul were filled with oil lamps, lanterns, and fireworks, while tulips glowed like jewels in the artificial light. These gatherings weren't just private palace affairs, and sometimes ordinary citizens joined in, strolling among the flowers. You walk slowly along a pathway lined with tulips in pots, each lit from below by tiny lamps. The petals glow translucent, as if each flower swallowed a candle and decided to become a lantern itself. Children dart past, clutching sweet confections, their laughter ringing above the music. Somewhere ahead, a flute plays a slow tune, weaving into the hum of voices. And then you catch sight of the spectacle everyone whispers about. Turtles wandering through the gardens with candles fixed to their shells. Yes, really. Quirky tidbit festival organizers sometimes tied small candles to the shells of tortoises, letting them lumber slowly through the beds of tulips, creating a moving constellation of light. It sounds like something from a fairy tale or maybe a questionable YouTube life hack, but for the Ottomans, it was part of the magic. The crowd moves like a tide, flowing past flower beds, stopping to marvel at rare blossoms, then drifting toward fountains where musicians sit. You hear the soft clang of a tambourine, the ripple of a lute. The night feels endless, the kind of night where even time itself stops to admire the flowers. Historians still argue whether these festivals were acts of genuine cultural joy or veiled political theater. Were they designed to distract citizens from economic issues? Or were they simply extravagant parties thrown by a ruling class that couldn't resist its own garden obsession? Whatever the motive, you can't deny the spell they cast. You pause by a fountain rim, dipping your hand into the cool water. Above you, lanterns sway like tiny planets. A tulip leans toward you, glowing in the candlelight. And for a moment you forget the guards, the politics, the poets, the sultans. All you see is a flower at night, alive in a city that has turned itself into a living dream. Someone presses a sherbet glass into your hand, sweet, chilled, fragrant with rose. You sip slowly, letting the coolness sink into your chest. Around you, Istanbul sparkles. Tulips and lanterns, laughter and music, turtles and candles. It's absurd, enchanting, and unforgettable all at once. The music of the festival fades behind you as you slip down a quieter street, and soon the air changes. The sweet scent of tulips is replaced by something more pungent: tobacco smoke. DMP wood, the faint metallic tang of coins passing hand to hand. You've stumbled into the murmur of markets after dark, where tulips are no longer symbols of beauty but hard currency whispered about like contraband. Historical fact, in the early 18th century, certain rare tulip bulbs in the Ottoman Empire were valued so highly that they could cost more than a skilled artisan's yearly wage. The most coveted varieties weren't sold openly in stalls but traded privately, often in shadowy corners of the city. You edge closer to a group of men huddled beneath a leaning balcony. One of them pulls a small cloth pouch from his robe and opens it like he's revealing diamonds. Inside, you glimpse the knobby shapes of tulip bulbs. They look like onions that have seen better days, yet the men lean in with hungry eyes. Prices are whispered, haggled, sealed with handshakes. To own one of these bulbs is to step closer to the ranks of the elite. Quirky tidbit. Records suggest some bulbs were traded for horses, land, or entire wardrobes of clothing. Imagine explaining to your spouse that you sold the family donkey because you just had to own a flower that blooms for 1 week out of the year. That's commitment or madness, depending on your perspective. You keep walking, catching snippets of other deals. A merchant promises a flame-striped tulip that only blooms once in a generation. Another insists he has a bulb smuggled directly from the Sultan's private beds. The air hums with secrecy. You realize that tulips here aren't just flowers, they're speculative assets. And like all markets built on desire, the bubble trembles on the edge of collapse. Historians still argue whether the Ottoman tulip trade truly spiraled into the same kind of mania that later gripped the Dutch. Some say prices inflated wildly, creating a fragile economy of petals and promises. Others argue it was more contained, a luxury fad limited to the palace elite. Whatever the truth, the image of men bartering bulbs in dim alleys adds a touch of noir to the story of a flower. A door creaks open and you glimpse the glow of lamplight inside. Shelves line the walls, not with books or spices, but with clay pots, each marked with symbols only insiders understand. You picture secret auctions where bulbs are unveiled like relics. Bids escalating until someone stakes their fortune on a piece of dirt wrapped in papery skin. You step back into the street, the pouch still fresh in your mind? The festival lanterns flicker faintly in the distance, but here, under sagging wooden balconies and whispering eaves, tulips aren't glowing ornaments. They're contraband, hoarded wealth, promises of prestige small enough to fit in your palm. And as you slip back into the night, you can't help thinking every empire has its black markets. This one just happens to deal in flowers. The backstreet hush of bulb trading fades as you follow a caravan road winding out of Istanbul. You imagine dust rising under camel hooves, wagons creaking, merchants humming tunes to pass the miles. Tulips, it turns out, were not content to stay within the empire's walls. They had wanderlust, hitching rides westward until they crossed into Europe and lit a second wave of obsession. Historical fact, by the mid-1500s, tulip bulbs had reached the Habsburg court in Vienna, courtesy of ambassadors to the Ottoman Empire. Within decades, they spread into the gardens of the Netherlands, where they ignited the infamous tulip mania of the 1630s, one of the first recorded speculative bubbles in European history. But before Amsterdam went flower crazy, there was Istanbul sending bulbs, ideas, and even gardeners westward. You picture a diplomat carefully packing tulip bulbs into crates with the tenderness of a parent tucking in a child. Across mountains and rivers, the bulbs rattled toward Europe, carrying the Ottoman aesthetic like stowaways. Quirky tidbit. In some tellings, a Viennese ambassador actually received tulip bulbs from an Ottoman official and mistook them for exotic vegetables. He planted them near cabbages before realizing he'd accidentally started a luxury craze. Honestly, it's the ultimate oops, all beauty moment. As you walk along the imagined road, you see ghostly images of what's to come. Dutch merchants hunched over contracts, speculators gambling fortunes on bulbs that might never bloom. Historians still argue whether the European mania was exaggerated in later retellings or truly as wild as the stories of bulbs trading for candleside mansions. Either way, the roots of that frenzy trace back here to Ottoman soil, Ottoman gardeners, Ottoman prestige. You pause on a hill overlooking the Bosphorus. Ships bob gently, lanterns glimmering like constellations on water. Somewhere among those holds are tulip bulbs, wrapped in straw, heading toward Dutch ports where they'll be renamed, resold, and repainted in oil on canvas. You realize the tulip is about to become more than a flower. It's about to become global currency, a bridge between empires. The night breeze tugs at your sleeve as if nudging you back toward the palace gardens. But for a moment, your mind lingers on those ships. It's funny something so delicate, a bloom that lasts barely a week, sailing across continents and reshaping economies. And yet, that's the power of obsession. You turn, letting the vision of Dutch windmills fade back into the shadows. Ahead, the Ottoman gardens still wait, tulips glowing softly, unaware that their cousins are destined to make history far from home. Section 11. You drift back through the city gates, the hum of caravans and distant ships fading like a dream until the palace walls loom once again. But this time, you're not thinking about bulbs as currency or cargo, you're thinking about the sheer artistry that gave them meaning here. Because the Ottomans didn't just grow tulips. They painted, stitched, and inscribed them until the flower became almost inseparable from the empire's identity. Historical fact: tulips became a major motif in Ottoman decorative arts, appearing on Iznik ceramics, woven into carpets, and even stylized on mosque tiles. The flower's shape, simple, upright, flame-like, was endlessly adaptable, making it a favorite in patterns that needed both elegance and repetition. You step into a workshop where artisans sit cross-legged before wooden frames. One grinds cobalt pigment, the deep blue staining his fingertips. Another dips a thin brush into vermilion. As the brush touches glazed tile, petals emerge, curved and sharp like tongues of fire. The wall slowly fills with a garden frozen in color. Quirky tidbit: tulips weren't only artistic symbols, they were even tied to letters of the Arabic alphabet. The word lali, tulip in Ottoman Turkish, shares letters with Allah. That linguistic echo added layers of spiritual resonance to the flower, giving it a sacred shimmer in art and poetry. Imagine being so into your favorite flower that you claim it's basically divine branding. You trail a hand over a silk fabric where tulips run in orderly rows, repeating like a chant. The flower is everywhere on coins, in miniature paintings, embroidered onto robes worn by courtiers. It's as though the empire wrapped itself in petals, weaving tulips into its public face and private rituals. And yet, historians still argue whether the tulip was a deliberate state symbol and emblem of imperial identity, or just a fashionable craze that spilled across media because artists and patrons alike couldn't get enough of it. Was it propaganda, or just popular design? No consensus, only patterns repeating like an unanswered question. You leave the workshop, stepping into a mosque courtyard. Lamps sway above you, casting soft halos on the tiles. Tulips bloom there too, stylized and eternal, reminding you that while real flowers wilt, art gives them permanence. The artisans who painted these blossoms are long gone, but their brushstrokes still hold the line of each petal, still catch the eye, still invite a whisper of awe. You sit on a cool stone bench and imagine the same bulb that once sparked shadowy deals in back alleys also inspired strokes of paint that would glow for centuries. It's almost unfair, really, flowers outlive bankers, but maybe that's the real joke history likes to play. You drift back through the city gates, the hum of caravans and distant ships fading like a dream, until the palace walls loom once again. But this time, you're not thinking about bulbs as currency or cargo. You're thinking about the sheer artistry that gave them meaning here. Because the Ottomans didn't just grow tulips. They painted, stitched, and inscribed them until the flower became almost inseparable from the empire's identity. Historical fact: tulips became a major motif in Ottoman decorative arts, appearing on Iznik ceramics, woven into carpets, and even stylized on mosque tiles. The flower's shape, simple, upright, flame-like, was endlessly adaptable, making it a favorite in patterns that needed both elegance and repetition. You step into a workshop where artisans sit cross-legged before wooden frames. One grinds cobalt pigment, the deep blue staining his fingertips. Another dips a thin brush into vermilion. As the brush touches glazed tile, petals emerge, curved and sharp like tongues of fire. The wall slowly fills with a garden frozen in color. Quirky tidbit: tulips weren't only artistic symbols, they were even tied to letters of the Arabic alphabet. The word lali, tulip in Ottoman Turkish, shares letters with Allah. That linguistic echo added layers of spiritual resonance to the flower, giving it a sacred shimmer in art and poetry. Imagine being so into your favorite flower that you claim it's basically divine branding. You trail a hand over a silk fabric where tulips run in orderly rows, repeating like a chant. The flower is everywhere on coins, in miniature paintings, embroidered onto robes worn by courtiers. It's as though the empire wrapped itself in petals, weaving tulips into its public face and private rituals. And yet, historians still argue whether the tulip was a deliberate state symbol and emblem of imperial identity, or just a fashionable craze that spilled across media because artists and patrons alike couldn't get enough of it. Was it propaganda or just popular design? No consensus, only patterns repeating like an unanswered question. You leave the workshop, stepping into a mosque courtyard. Lamps sway above you, casting soft halos on the tiles. Tulips bloom there too, stylized and eternal, reminding you that while real flowers wilt, art gives them permanence. The artisans who painted these blossoms are long gone, but their brushstrokes still hold the line of each petal, still catch the eye, still invite a whisper of awe. You sit on a cool stone bench and imagine, the same bulb that once sparked shadowy deals in back alleys also inspired strokes of paint that would glow for centuries. It's almost unfair, really, flowers outlive bankers? But maybe that's the real joke history likes to play. The mosque courtyard fades, and now you're back among the palace corridors where soft lamps mark your way. Somewhere behind the latticed windows, voices murmur poets, scribes, and calligraphers leaning over pages, spinning tulips into words instead of pigments. Because what would a craze be without poetry? Historical fact: during the reign of Sultan Ahmed III, early 1700s, tulips became such a cultural fixation that the entire period is remembered as the tulip era. Poets compared the flower to burning candles, to lovers' lips, to fleeting beauty-delicate metaphors that fluttered through courtly gatherings like butterflies. You ease into a chamber where a poet reclines on cushions, a tulip vase placed reverently at his side. He scratches lines onto paper, verses that glow with devotion to a bloom that lives for only days. Someone reads them aloud, the syllables spilling like water. The tulip isn't just a flower anymore, it's a mirror for longing, impermanence, and desire. Quirky tidbit: tulips even sparked poetry games, where writers competed to produce verses as delicate as petals. One misstep, a clunky rhyme, a limp metaphor, and the audience groaned. In other words, early modern slam poetry nights, minus the microphones and espresso. You listen as a singer sets a verse to music, the id resonating with slow, lilting chords. The words bend with the melody, like tulips bowing in the breeze. There's an intimacy in it, as if every note tries to hold the flower's brief life a little longer. Historians still argue whether tulip poetry was genuinely heartfelt or a symptom of cultural excess. Did these poets really swoon over petals, or were they just caught in the slipstream of a fashionable fad? No one can quite decide. Perhaps it was both sincere yearning dressed in the language of trend. You close your eyes and imagine strolling through those garden festivals we saw earlier. But now each blossom is humming, reciting verses under its breath. The whole empire becomes a recitation, petals and poems blending into a single texture. The poet beside you pauses, sighs, and dips his brush again. Ink stains his fingers like gardener's dirt, but more permanent. You realize tulips don't just fade into soil, they seep into words, into memory, into the collective imagination. And unlike the petals that fall in a week, these words might still be whispered centuries later. The poet's chamber drifts away, and now you find yourself among the courtiers themselves, the men and women who could afford to treat tulips as both status symbol and playground. Gold-threaded caftans sweep along marble floors. Servants carry trays not of jewels, but of carefully potted bulbs, each one labeled like a crown jewel. Historical fact: in the early 18th century, owning rare tulip varieties became a badge of prestige in Ottoman high society. Pashas and viziers competed to display the most unusual blooms, hosting nighttime garden parties lit by hundreds of oil lamps. Guests wandered among glowing petals as musicians played and fountains gurgled in the background. You imagine walking into such a gathering? Lanterns line the pathways and tulips glow like tiny flames in the dusk. Courtiers lean close to admire one another's flowers, whispering as though they're trading state secrets. The real spectacle isn't the petals themselves, it's the competition. The showing off, the quiet mine is rarer than yours. Quirky tidbit: some nobles went so far as to commission special tulip beds arranged in patterns viewable only from balconies above. Imagine the humble gardener rolling his eyes at yet another demand to plant flowers in the shape of a family crest. A flute plays in the distance, and silk sleeves brush against your arm as you pass through the crowd. The tulips sway and breeze in lamplight, half spectacle, half luxury accessory. You notice that even conversation is peppered with floral metaphors. Someone's beauty compared to a crimson bloom, someone's temper to a broken stem. But historians still argue whether this tulip era, Court culture was a genuine aesthetic renaissance or an early form of conspicuous consumption. Was it about beauty, or was it really just about flaunting wealth with delicate flowers instead of diamonds? Either way, you can sense both delight and absurdity in the air. You recline at the edge of a fountain, watching petals float across its surface. Nobles are laughing, servants refill wine cups, and the tulips stand, silent witnesses to vanity and joy alike. You can't help but think, at some point, the flower stopped being just a flower. It became a mirror, showing people who they wanted to be. The party lingers, but as dawn threatens, whispers drift through the garden like smoke. Tulips are slipping from delight into danger. You follow the murmurs into a quieter corner of the city where traders haggle in candlelit rooms. These aren't poets or pashas anymore, they're merchants counting coins. Their fingers stained not by ink or soil, but by greed. Historical fact: by the 1720s, rare tulip bulbs in the Ottoman Empire were fetching prices so high that entire fortunes could vanish or be made overnight. The craze mirrored the Dutch tulip mania a century earlier. One bulb of a rare striped variety could cost more than a skilled craftsman's annual wages, sometimes even more than a house. Quirky tidbit: some Ottoman merchants reportedly disguised tulip bulbs as loaves of bread to smuggle them without alerting rivals or tax collectors. Imagine unwrapping your lunch only to find an absurdly expensive root vegetable staring back at you. You drift through a cramped chamber where men debate feverishly. Their voices rise like market criers, each insisting his bulb is rarer, more precious, practically glowing with destiny. They gesture wildly over ledgers. The air smells of sweat and lamp oil, not flowers. Tulips here are less about poetry and more about speculation. But historians still argue whether the so-called Ottoman tulip bubble truly matched the scale of the Dutch frenzy, or whether later writers exaggerated it to poke fun at a decadent age. Was it really financial chaos, or just colorful gossip embroidered by moralists who wanted to scold the elite? Either way, you can feel the tension. Behind the laughter of the garden parties, there's panic brewing whispers of bankruptcies, of families ruined over petals. Even the gardeners, once content in their soil, now feel pressure to breed rarer and rarer varieties. The tulip that was once a symbol of quiet joy now teeters on the edge of becoming a national punchline. As you wander back into the cool night air, the contrast is sharp. Tulips glowing softly under lanterns in the palace, and tulips locked in crates like prisoners of commerce. You wonder how long beauty can survive when it's treated like currency? The murmur of coin counting fades, replaced by the low sigh of history winding itself toward an inevitable turn. You drift forward into the 1730s, when the tulip obsession finally stumbled. Whispers of extravagance turned into open resentment. Ordinary citizens, weary of watching elites throw fortunes at fragile petals, began to grumble louder, and eventually the grumbling swelled into revolt. Historical fact: in 1730, the Patrona Halo Rebellion erupted in Istanbul. Discontent over economic pressures, military grievances, and the perceived decadence of Sultan Ahmed III's court combined in a storm of fury. Tulips, those innocent flowers, became shorthand for waste, indulgence, and rulers too distracted by gardens to govern. Quirky tidbit: it's said that when rebels stormed the city, they destroyed elaborate tulip beds alongside palaces, trampling the delicate blooms underfoot. Imagine staging a revolution and pausing just long enough to stomp on someone's flower patch. It sounds petty, but in symbolism, it was devastating, crushing beauty to reclaim dignity. You walk through a garden littered with broken stems. The air that once hummed with flute music is now taut with the crackle of torches. The fountains still run, but they splash against scattered petals instead of reflected lanterns. The tulip era collapses not with quiet fading, but with a violent pruning. Historians still argue whether tulips were truly the cause or merely the scapegoat for broader unrest. Were flowers really to blame, or were they simply the easiest emblem of a court too lost in luxury? Whatever the answer, the tulip's golden age in Ottoman lands ended abruptly, replaced by austerity and suspicion of frivolity. Yet, as you stroll through the ruins of those once glorious beds, you sense that beauty never disappears entirely, it just hides, waiting for another age to rediscover it. The tulip retreats underground, literally and figuratively, like a bulb biding its time until the soil feels safe again. And here, as the story slows, you too are invited to rest. The garden grows still. The night air softens, carrying only the faintest trace of crushed petals and damp earth. Lamps sputter out one by one, their glow replaced by the cool silver of moonlight. The echoes of laughter, music, and feverish bargaining fade into silence like ripples settling across a fountain. Your breathing matches the rhythm of that hush, in, out. In, out. Every exhale releases the bustle of courts and markets. Every inhale gathers the calm of empty pathways lined with resting flowers. The tulips, even trampled, seem at peace now. Their stems bow gently, their petals fold like tired eyelids. You notice the soil around them cradling the bulbs, holding the promise of blooms to come. Just as the Ottomans once found comfort in tending their gardens, you too can rest knowing that beauty renews itself quietly, without demand, without hurry. The city beyond sleeps, the palace sleeps, the merchants and rebels all sleep. You are left in a space where time slows and even history whispers instead of shouts. Whatever debates scholars still have, they drift far away from you now, distant as lanterns fading over the horizon. Let the story dissolve into a softer rhythm, where tulips aren't fortunes or symbols, they're just flowers again, swaying gently in the breeze, their roots tucked into the earth like you tucked under your blanket. Close your eyes, ease your thoughts, and let yourself drift like a petal floating on calm water. History can wait until tomorrow. Tonight belongs to silence, softness, and the simple comfort of rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.